balance, and that balance requires that you're conscientious that by speaking about it publicly too frequently, not only are you giving recognition and oxygen to those who do these things that are despicable, but you could also be jeopardizing investigators' opportunity to have a step ahead of those that are carrying out these types of unforgivable acts. At the same time, it can also put those who are being threatened in harm's way, them and their family. It draws more attention on them. So I remember on election night, or maybe around that time frame, it's somewhat of a blur now, there was a particular media outlet that asked me about some threats, and I said, we're not going to discuss them. And they said, that's not very transparent, and my response was, you're right. It's not because we lack transparency, it's just that because if I am to share these things during the course of an investigation, everything I just described to you becomes, it's in jeopardy. And that's not the type of leader that I'm going to be for this organization. That's not the type of investigators and deputies that we have committed to this organization. We care first and foremost about the safety of others. And we also care about being thorough and detailed investigators so that we can prosecute people who do things that are in violation of the law. So I'll touch just a little bit on this last election. Have there been threats? Absolutely. Has it been against any one singular individual? No. Those threats were cast broad and wide. And they were irresponsible, and they were arrogant, and they were selfish, and they were criminal. And our investigators are hard at work to determine who is responsible for these types of threats and what the capability is for them to carry out the potential threats. A lot of these things came from folks out of state. And I think I said at one point in time in one of the news conferences that Arizona's doing just fine. And although we may have our differences and we may see things that go on here that maybe cause us concern, we do not need interference from people outside of the state to tell us how to run an election or what elected officials are deserving to be in their positions. We get to choose. You don't. And you don't get to threaten the people that lead this state. That's unacceptable, and we're not going to tolerate it. So if you're going to ask me about anybody in particular, I'll do my best to give you an honest and direct answer, but I'm not going to go in conflict with what I just described to you, and I hope that you can understand that. So who would like to go first?
Against some of these threats at all?
We haven't arrested anyone or filed any indictments as yet, but I can tell you that our investigators continue to look into any and all aspects of these types of threats. I think that, I've spoken before about those who are either leaders or in positions to speak publicly, and some of the things that they're saying provoke others to feel as though they should act, and then you see this having more life than it should. Should never have occurred, but it should sure as heck be long over by now. But some are given life to it, and that's not only unfortunate, but it's irresponsible.
Two questions. One is, can you speak specifically to the social media threat made against Chairman Gates that led him to vacate his home for a night? And then secondly, just in general, from your perspective as law enforcement, what does the intensity of threats look like after this election as opposed to immediately after the 2020 election?
Well, let me put it into context first. I've been on both sides of this. I've been in this business a long time, and in my past, I have been on the side where threats were lodged against me. And the only reason I say that to you is because Chairman Gates was relocated for one night, and I know that was already discussed, and that was by my, I wouldn't say directive, but I told him I thought it was in his best interest for one reason. I'm always going to err on the side of overreacting to keep people safe, much like what you saw at the recorder's office. And until I felt that our detectives had a chance to get their arms around any potential threats that may do harm to him or his family, I was not going to allow for them to be in harm's way. So that was a circumstance where we felt we wanted to be overly aggressive for his safety. Regarding the details of that particular, what led to that, I won't tell you it was any one singular thing, and I won't disclose anything regarding that investigation because we want to hold people accountable, and they can hide behind their keyboards and have this kind of keyboard courage, and they can use technology to disguise their false bravado. But at the end of the day, the people who have to lead this state and this nation are the ones who oftentimes are in harm's way and at risk to those cowards, and we have to take a stand against it. And that means even the people who politically maybe didn't see the outcomes they were hoping for. Have some courage and speak out and say these types of threats aren't okay against our opponents any more than they wouldn't be okay against us. And I think when we unite in that manner, then we'll be a better state and a better nation. So I apologize, I can't really give you specifics on that social post. And again, I take, call it responsibility or whatever you want, for the relocation of Supervisor Gates and his family for one evening to make sure that we had a better grasp on any potential threats against him.
As to my second question, do you need me to restate it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. All good. I asked two at once. That was my
Yeah.
fault.
I can't chew gum and walk at the same time, so I can't answer two questions at once or ignore the second one.
I'm just wondering, from what you've seen, is the intensity of threats right now, after this election, more intense, less intense, about the same as it was in 2020?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that people have become very comfortable with utilizing technology to their advantage when they want to do things that are as disrespectful and unacceptable as pose threats like cowards from distant spaces. So I just think that there's been a natural escalation because the folks feel emboldened, and they have people in office or running for elected office who are empowering them, and it needs to stop. So do I think that any certain factors have kind of created this escalation? I just think it's growing on top of itself until we do something to stop it from moving forward. And right now the momentum is kind of at that tipping point where we're going to work hard to push it back, and those who want to do bad things want to push it forward. But I don't think there's any one thing that occurred here in Arizona from the last election that suddenly made it more of a comfortable practice. I just think that there's bad people that use technology in bad ways.
How often would you say a situation like the one with Chairman Gates has happened previously when you have hit locations for the safety? Is that something that you would say is common for somebody that is a high elected official like him, or would you say that's something that doesn't really happen that frequently?
Well, I think that it probably happens with more frequency than it should. I just think it's getting a lot more exposure right now. And that's not like a point that you guys or a criticism. I just think that this kind of global, everybody suddenly thinks they're a journalist. Everybody thinks that they have the power to post their thoughts online and that their words matter more than somebody else's. So it's becoming more commonplace. Now, I've been the sheriff for almost 6 years, so I've been through really, 3 election cycles, I guess, not counting my own. I mean, when I was actually in the seat of being sheriff, in last election, nobody knew about all the resources that we dedicated to different elected officials on both sides of the party line and at all different levels, not just county officials, but state officials who live in our jurisdiction. I dedicated a lot of resources to ensure their safety because of protesters believing it's acceptable to go to an elected official's home, which it is not. People feeling as though that threats should intimidate elected officials to do what they want, not what the elected official chooses to do or what's right. So law enforcement is suddenly more burdened with this, and it is a common practice. But I just think that this particular most recent circumstance is getting a lot of exposure. But it's unfortunately one of many we've dealt with. You guys are probably very upset with me today because I'm not giving you good sound bites. It's all lengthy, but that's my tactic. I'm going to filibuster. What
Any
else?
significant differences from the primaries versus, if you're in November from back in August to here? Did you say it got worse or it got better, or what would you say the differences were from August to November?
Yeah, I think that the last election in some ways, caught us by surprise. So I think that the volume of folks that showed up at the recorder's office and tried to create some unrest, we were responsive versus proactive. I think this time we were better prepared to mitigate it. But a presidential election when everyone in the nation feels impacted is a heck of a lot more robust, and people feel a lot more passionate about it. This election, although there were some federal offices at stake, it really was a state election. So, there was some noise, but it's nowhere to the gravity of a presidential. So, in many ways, we saw this as preparation for the next one, to let people know in Maricopa County we will run fair and free elections, and law enforcement will hold the line to protect the people in polling places. And that's not going to change. We're just going to keep getting better at it.
I'm not sure if you saw the video or the post by Carrie Lake today just surrounding how this past election cycle destroyed any trust in our elections. Do you have any thoughts on kind of what her rhetoric, like what kind of impact that could have on the elected official safety potentially?
So I'm glad at the conclusion of your question you talked more so about like the behavior and how it affects things more so than any individual candidates. Because what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to stoop to the level where I make this personal between myself and anybody else, and that's not intended for that candidate, because there's a lot of candidates that say things I wish they wouldn't. But at the end of the day, if you truly care about people and you care about the safety of the community, then you have to care about your words and how you choose and use them. And it's unfortunate when you're on the downside of a ballot, and if you feel as though there was something inappropriate that went on along the way, we have a heck of a system, and it's not perfect, but we have a heck of a judicial system and a process here, election system. Work towards improving it as opposed to just sitting back and criticizing it, because real people are doing real jobs to get real results, and you put them in real harm, and that's not okay. Anything else I can answer for you guys? Again, I appreciate your patience. As I said, I probably wasn't going to give you everything you were looking for today, but I hope that it was helpful for what you're trying to cover. Going forward, I would tell you that as it relates to these investigations, until we have something that is at a stage where we feel comfortable in releasing it, and I've directed the chairman also that their office, any emails, communications, things of that nature that fall into the realm of evidence for a criminal investigation will be confidential until we get to a crossroads where either we're arresting somebody or we've deemed that that case is no longer a criminal act. So I know that those are things that are helpful for you, but just understand that we have to protect the investigation, so those kinds of things will be protected. And leads to another question. Yes?
One more. And I don't know if you can answer it, but are other people getting protection security details besides Chairman Gates? So like Reporter Richard, some of the folks who are kind of high profile who work at the elections department, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the best way I could answer this is we're not the only law enforcement agency responsible for elected officials who may, this is a day-to-day proposition. Just the election brings it to a greater focus, but during the course of the year, people say unkind things and unlawful things. So it's kind of a fluid element. If you're asking if my office is highly involved, I'd say we're highly involved in making sure we're paying attention to everybody that we should be to ensure their safety and that of their families. And I would just ask those of you out there that really care about your own family, why don't you care a little about somebody else's too, and help us keep folks safe. And when it comes to these things, just be cautious with your words. All right?
I know you can't go into it.
I was so close to getting out the door.
And again, I'm not sure if you can answer this, but can you give any kind of numbers in terms of the number of threats that you're looking into? Just I know you don't want to go into specifics, you can't go into specifics, but just broad numbers about how many you're looking into. Is it dozens? Is it hundreds? I mean, what are we talking here, numbers wise?
Well, I think that the challenge is my definition of a threat in yours are probably going to be a little bit different. You guys are journalists. I don't know if I'm choosing the right word, but just the vitriol that is posted or left in voicemails or sent in emails and things of that nature. We're trying to decipher what is a threshold for a criminal threat versus what is just language that is offensive and could be threatening. But oftentimes the greatest threat doesn't come from the one that you see and you hear. It's the one that is quiet in the background. That's the one who is prepared to do the most harm, and that's the hardest part for us is, we hear and we see and we investigate all these things, but what about the folks that aren't popping up onto our radar? They're the ones that oftentimes are the ones we're most concerned to find and to root out. So the number is higher than it should be, but probably not as high as some folks would think it is. Did I skirt that well enough? Thank you, guys.